Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things in the whole world, and that is the dopamine system and stimulants. More importantly, how to get the most out of stimulants. And if you watch this video all the way through, you have all the knowledge you need to never get another afternoon crash from caffeine. So let's start with the very basics of what is a stimulant. A stimulant is just a substance that increases activity in the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And this increases alertness, attention, and typically makes you feel more motivated. You all know what this feels like. It's just when you have a cup of coffee, that is the feeling of a stimulant. To better understand how stimulants work, I want to start by describing how the dopamine system works without stimulants. So, where does dopamine come from to begin with? Like most neurotransmitters, dopamine is made from an amino acid. Dopamine in particular is made from an amino acid called tyrosine. Now, amino acids are just the basic building blocks of proteins. So, proteins contain amino acids, and we use these amino acids to make other things like dopamine. Where dopamine actually comes from is we eat a food containing tyrosine. This would be something like red meat, milk, hemp seeds, cheese. So, we eat this food that contains tyrosine, goes into our mouth, down our throat, into our stomach. It's broken down into its component parts, one of them being tyrosine. And that all travels further down your digestive tract. And the tyrosine enters your bloodstream through the wall of your small intestine. And that travels in your circulatory system, in your blood, up to your brain. And it gets to the blood-brain barrier, which is just a filter that lets certain things through into your brain and keeps other things out. And to get through the blood-brain barrier, you either have to be small and fat-soluble or have the help of a friend facilitated into the blood-brain barrier. Tyrosine is very large, so it gets through the blood-brain barrier with the help of something called large neural amino acid transporter 1, a very apt name because it is large. It is going to become a neurotransmitter, and it's amino acid 1. So once inside the brain, it makes its way to the dopaminergic neurons. Dopaminergic is just a fancy way of saying the neurons that deal in dopamine. They release and are receptive to dopamine. So once the tyrosine is inside the dopaminergic neuron, it can start the process of being converted from tyrosine to dopamine. Little recap of what I've said so far. Dopamine is made from an amino acid called tyrosine. We get tyrosine in our diet. We eat it, it goes in our stomach, gets into our blood, comes up to our brain, makes its way into the neurons that deal with dopamine, and then the process can start from converting tyrosine into dopamine. Now, how does that process happen? Tyrosine is first converted from tyrosine into L-DOPA by tyrosine hydroxylase, and then that L-DOPA is converted from L-DOPA to dopamine by something called aromatic L-amino acid decarboxylase. I bet that didn't make sense, so I'll break it down with the analogy of a cookie. You can think of it like a blank cookie is a normal tyrosine, and the first worker puts frosting on it, then pass it to the next worker, and they put sprinkles on it, and now you have a finished cookie that you can package up and send out. So basically, the first worker takes tyrosine, adds something to it, you have L-DOPA, take the L-DOPA, add something to it, now you have dopamine. But similar to a cookie, just because you have the cookie doesn't mean you can just throw it out the door and hope for someone to eat it. You have to package it up and wait for an order to come. Packaging it up, in this case, means taking the dopamine and putting it into something called vesicles. I'll put a diagram on the screen. A vesicle is just a bubble full of a particular molecule. In this case, it's dopamine, so these are dopamine vesicles, and the loading of dopamine into the vesicles is done by an enzyme called vesicular monoamine transporter 2. An order, in this case, is what people typically call a brain signal. It's actually called an action potential. And these come from the typical things you think of as like things that release dopamine. So like if you're at a casino and you see a slot machine, or if you're scrolling and you see something funny on your phone, or you see a puppy, or you see some food that looks really good, that information is taken by your brain, processed, and if it perceives the information it's receiving as rewarding, then it will send that action potential to your dopaminergic neurons and tell it to release the dopamine. So the release actually happens when the vesicles full of the dopamine molecules bind to the inside of the presynaptic neuron, and they fuse and they release all the dopamine molecules. They cross the synaptic cleft, and then they bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. I'll put another diagram on the screen so you can see what I mean. The presynaptic neuron is just the individual in the chain of communication before, and the postsynaptic is the one after. kind of like a game of telephone. If I'm telling you a secret, I'd be the presynaptic neuron and you'd be the postsynaptic neuron. So the first neuron releases the dopamine, second neuron has receptors that the dopamine binds to. And when the dopamine binds to the receptor is the critical moment when you're actually feeling the effects of dopamine. But unfortunately, the dopamine does not stay bound to the receptors forever. It's recollected back into the presynaptic neuron by something called the dopamine transporter. You can think of this as like the hungry hippo. So once dopamine is released, the dopamine transporter, the hungry hippo, just goes and recollects all the dopamine from the synaptic cleft and brings it back into the presynaptic neuron to be reused or recycled. One very important note is that your genes play a big role in how this process operates for you. So if you have a very active variant of the gene that makes the dopamine transporter or the hungry hippo, it's going to be doing a lot more of the recollecting of dopamine. If you have a very inactive variant of the gene that's converting tyrosine into L-DOPA, then it'll be doing a lot less of that process. So the different genes that you have will affect how much dopamine you have at a baseline and how different stimulants affect you in particular, because different stimulants affect different parts of this process. So another recap, dopamine is made from an amino acid called tyrosine. Tyrosine is consumed in your diet, makes its way into the brain. The neurons convert tyrosine into dopamine. And then when you see something that triggers the release of dopamine, that dopamine is released from one neuron and received by another neuron. And that's when the feeling of dopamine happens. So one of the most popular stimulants is Adderall. And the way it works is by disrupting the packaging of dopamine into these vesicles. So typically package the dopamine in vesicles and then wait for it to be released. It just pops all those vesicles and releases all the dopamine all at once. And it blocks the reuptake. So the hungry hippo that's trying to regulate how much dopamine is released, it just blocks that process. So it's just like abundant dopamine being released. Same exact pharmacologic process takes place for meth. Adderall and meth are similar compounds, and they do the exact same thing in the brain. The difference between people who take meth as a prescription and people who smoke Adderall is you're consuming meth in a way higher quantity than you would be getting prescribed Adderall. You're smoking it, so it's getting in your system way faster than Adderall would, and it's typically way less pure unless you're getting it from Walter White. So that's why meth is so harmful and Adderall is not so much. There's other variations of Adderall and amphetamines that don't reverse the vesicle process. They don't pop all the vesicles. They just block the reuptake. You can think of these as reuptake inhibitors because that's what they're called. And those are things like modafinil or Wellbutrin is an antidepressant that does this, and it just blocks the hungry hippo from recollecting the dopamine as much, so more of it is available to bind to the receptors. Cocaine also works in a similar way to these reuptake inhibitors. It just blocks the reuptake of the dopamine into the presynaptic neuron. And crack, exact same thing as cocaine. Again, just the difference between cocaine and crack. If you smoke crack, you're getting a lot more in your system a lot faster, which is why it's way more addictive. But let's take it down from the hardcore stuff and take it down one notch to nicotine. Nicotine is not strictly a stimulant. It does other things in your brain. But as far as the dopamine system goes, nicotine binds to the dopaminergic neurons on acetylcholine nicotinamide receptors. And basically, instead of disrupting one of the parts of this process by disrupting the reuptake or reversing the vesicle packaging, it just speeds up the whole process. So it's like a worker going into the cookie factory and just like yelling at everyone to hurry up. It doesn't actually disrupt any process. It just speeds the whole thing up. Now, I saved the best for last. I want to talk about everyone's favorite stimulant, caffeine. So caffeine works in a pretty interesting way. There's another molecule in your brain called adenosine. And when adenosine builds up, you feel really tired and sleepy. If you've ever pulled an all-nighter, you know what adenosine feels like. Your eyes are heavy and you're not really thinking very much. Adenosine binds to receptors and decreases activity in the neurons. And what caffeine does is it counteracts this process by blocking the adenosine receptors. It binds to the receptors that adenosine wants to bind to and doesn't allow the adenosine to bind to it. It's called a adenosine receptor antagonist. And this just means the thing that would have made you sleepy is now no longer able to make you sleepy. So you feel more awake. That's all that caffeine's doing. It's not even really affecting the dopamine directly. The reason you get an afternoon crash is because it's just the adenosine that builds up in your brain while you're sleeping. You want it to be there while you're asleep. And then when you wake up, your brain's flushing out that adenosine. It takes 90 to 120 minutes for the adenosine that was present when you were asleep to flush out after you wake up. And if you have caffeine in those first 90 to 120 minutes after you wake up, this natural flushing out of adenosine doesn't happen. So then later in the day, when the caffeine wears off, all the adenosine that should have been flushed out is still there, and it binds to the adenosine receptors, and you feel all the tiredness that you never flushed out in the morning. The very simple way to avoid this is just delay your caffeine intake by 90 to 120 minutes after you wake up, so all the adenosine can naturally flush out. You can also speed up the flushing out of adenosine by getting exercise, getting sunlight in your eyes, drinking water, etc. But most important thing is waiting 90 to 120 minutes to consume your caffeine. However, the other caveat with caffeine and all stimulants is if you have them too late in the day, it'll disrupt your sleep. And if you're taking stimulants, it's probably because you want more energy, and disrupting your sleep is like the worst thing you can do for having energy. So my rule of thumb for caffeine is wait 90 to 120 minutes to have my first dose, but cut off consumption 12 hours before bedtime. So if you're going to go to bed at 10 p.m., cut off caffeine at 10 a.m. That's what I do. Other stimulants like Adderall have a much longer half-life, and they don't affect the adenosine system. So if you're going to take like an extended release Adderall, you should take it like first thing in the morning so you can have it cleared out by the time you're ready to go to bed. But general rule of thumb is stimulants will keep you awake, so keep them as far away from bedtime as you practically can. There's a couple other ways you can increase the effect you get from stimulants. Number one is most of them are mild diuretics, which means they make you pee more. It's not really a problem with caffeine because you're typically drinking caffeine in liquid form, so it's offsetting this. But one important aspect is just make sure you're staying hydrated. If you want to increase how quickly and how hard a stimulant hits, you can just have it on an empty stomach. Simple idea is that if there's nothing blocking your digestive tract, it'll be absorbed more quickly. And the last thing I'll say to maximize how much you're getting out of stimulants is amphetamines like Adderall do not get absorbed as well in your stomach if it's in a very acidic environment. So if you take a lot of vitamin C in particular, or a bunch of acidic foods like lime or something, before you take your amphetamines, it won't be absorbed as much. So another thing to think about. And last but not least, the unfortunate truth for all of this is that your brain will build up a tolerance no matter what you do. Like I said, the dopamine is released and it binds to these receptors, and that is what you're actually feeling as dopamine being released. But if these receptors are constantly bound by dopamine, they undergo a process called receptor internalization, which means they go inside the cell, so they're not there to be bound anymore. So it'll just reduce the number of available receptors, so all the dopamine that's released will not have as great an effect. And that doesn't matter if you're switching from caffeine to Adderall or nicotine or whatever. It's the actual dopamine receptors at the end of the chain that are being taken away. So there's not really a fancy way to like manipulate which drugs you're taking to get around this process. Unfortunately, the only thing you really do about it is take tolerance breaks. And that's what I do. I'll go a couple days with caffeine, and then maybe I'll take Adderall like on the weekend. And then I'll go a couple days without any stimulants at all to reset my tolerance. Unfortunately, we don't have any technology to get around this process, but they're working on it. So when that comes out, you best believe I'll make a video and let you know how to never build up a tolerance to stimulants and feel stimulated for the rest of your life. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you have anything you want me to make a video about, let me know and I'll do it. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye.